Okay, portrait editing. We are diving into some of the more advanced techniques in editing in Lightroom. Specifically, we're going to be covering techniques and strategies in editing portraits. For that, we're going to be using 3 different examples, including a photograph I took that was recently featured in the Chicago Tribune. Whoop! Of jazz pianist Dan Murphy. We're going to be looking at a maternity shoot that I did, and then we're going to be looking at a more traditional studio portrait taken by Jordan from our portrait lighting demo series. So let's get started. I've imported all of these photos from a photo shoot that I did with a jazz trio last year, including a couple of portraits of each of the musicians. So I figured this would be a good place to start because these are all environmental portraits. I took them in the place where the musicians performed their music right after they got done with the concert, and I think it's a good place to start. So I've imported this folder with the Dan Murphy Jazz Trio, and I have them installed in my library. I've already rated a couple of portraits that I know I'd like to take a closer look at today in our demo. And then I'm going to go into the develop module to start in on that process. Cool. So I have my photo pulled up, and just like with anything, we want to start off by finding a good sense of color correction and white balance. Now, because I took this photo on the fly, being asked to take portraits right after the event photo shoot, I didn't have a color checker card with me. So this is a really good example of being able to use what you have in order to find the right white balance. So what I'm going to do is take my white balance selector here, and luckily Dan is wearing a nice gray suit and shirt, so I might be able to sample just from right there. It does look like the grays in the background could work, but they're a little bit yellow leaning, I think. So if I hit that, all of a sudden I have this really better balanced image, and you can kind of see the difference here if I side by side the before and after. That little move, just sampling from his shirt there, eliminated a bunch of the yellows that are in the frame. So I will undo that, undo my before after, come back to my regular square just for normal viewing. The next thing I want to do is find my white and black point. So I'm going to hold down my option key and use that slider. It looks like the windows that are behind him are probably going to be fairly blown out, which isn't something I can 100% fix, but I can get close. Here we go. And then the blacks. Our deepest darks are kind of in that grand piano and on his side there. There we go. And then what I'm going to do is pop on down to my lens corrections and check that remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections. Cool. So now I have a couple of those basic edits made, and I'm ready to start down the process of editing. The first thing I'm going to do is add 10 points of contrast. With portraits, I like to add between 10 and 20 points, depending on the image. We have some really nice soft light, so I just want to add a tiny bit more of punch, a tiny bit more of detail. As I'm editing portraits, I'm always zooming in on the eyes to make sure that the eyes are super nice, sharp, in focus here, and it looks like I nailed it on this one, so that is very good news. And then with portraits, the other thing I like to do is pull out some of the clarity just so that we get a tiny bit of a softening effect on the skin and the environment, and those contrasty areas come forth even more. So you can see with the clarity added, I've kind of softened things out, allowing me to, punch up a bit more in my tone curve as I make my way down. I might pop up my exposure a tiny bit. It does look like, I have quite a few of these sort of dark leaning mid-tones here in my histogram. So I might pop my exposure up just, no more than a third stop. So 0.3 would be a third stop, +1 would be a full stop. If I add too much, like we talked about in our bracketing demo, things can start to get a little bit muddy, which we want to avoid. Great. The next thing I'm going to do is take down a little bit of my highlights in the window here. Hopefully that helps, but we're going to mask that out in a second too, which I'll show you as we move forward in some of these more advanced techniques. I'm going to pop up my lights about 10. I always like adding just a tiny bit more light between 5 and 10 just to pop out some of those brighter areas, really make that image start to sing. And then I'm going to add a bit more detail to my darks by popping up my darks somewhere between plus 10 and plus 20. I'm going to air maybe plus 15, see how that looks. I can also just use that slider. Cool. And then my shadows, I can pull those down a tiny bit if I want to add even more contrast. And you can see if I turn off and on my tone curve here, it's pretty nuanced. It's not a lot going on, but it just adds that pop of brightness and additional contrast without me having to push and pull that contrast slider from one point to another, because this is sort of the heavy-handed approach of making things have a little bit more of that punchiness to them. The tone curve is a softer, more nuanced way of managing your contrast, which is really helpful in a portrait. So, looking good so far. It doesn't look like I need to recover a whole lot in shadows, but because I have some overhead lights in the church where I took this photo, there's a little bit of an orange tone to everything. What I might do is go over to my HSL window, and I'm going to take out some of the oranges. Yeah, that's a little bit nicer. And some of the yellows. Now, on portraits, you never want to take out reds because red is the color of blood. And if you ever take down saturation of reds in a portrait, your person starts to look like a super creepy vampire really fast. So I want to avoid that at all costs. But taking down a little bit of the oranges and yellows is really helpful, especially if you're photographing in a place with tungsten light, like in our case here. All right, so now what to do with the windows. Obviously, the windows in this picture are super bright. The first thing I'm going to start with is just by cropping in a little bit. So I hit my R button for crop. I'm going to keep that aspect ratio, kind of crop out this religious figure there in the background, and I'm going to make sure that Dan's portrait is right on the third here with my rule of thirds. And it's okay if I'm cropping off the figure in the background, not worried about him. I want to make sure I have the grand piano and I have Dan right here on that third. Perfect. And now all of a sudden the portrait is all about this guy. Masking. This is something that can be really helpful if you have light coming from a lot of different places in a portrait. And I'm going to use a new tool for this, or a tool we haven't covered yet in our portrait or in our editing demos. This is called the graduated filter. You can also hit the M button to get there, but it's this little square notated up here at the top. If I click that, I have all of these different options that I can selectively mask into any area in my image. So right now it's set to burn highlights, which is one of my favorites, especially for windows or the sky. I use this all the time. But of course I can also set it to do things like manage temperature, tint, exposure, contrast, and any permutation within that. And as I become more comfortable with these, I can even build my own versions. So for example, let's start with burn highlights because I want to darken the highlights of the window here. And it's already preset to take down my exposure by 1/10 of a stop, and it's going to take down my highlights minus 36 points. I'm going to draw a line from the top of this image coming down over the windows. And you see how it kind of burns that in really nicely. If I hit that button again or hit M, it will go away. And I can see if I hit my backslash button underneath the delete key here, the windows are already being managed so much better. I'm going to do the same thing to this little corner down here. So I'm going to hit M, or I can hit the graduated filter button over here and pull over, pull over that guy over some of the highlights. Now, if I do want to make any edits to that preset, like taking highlights down even more, which you can see the floor changing beneath his stool here. I can actually save this as a new preset. So let's say I want to make an intense burn highlights that has a -76 or something, whatever I use for that. I can always hit Save Current Settings as new preset, and that will allow me to create a burn highlights intense version that's my own edit and hit create. And then I can always come back to this one, which is now an option. Cool. All right, I'm gonna hit M again, and that'll get us out of that mask. And what I can do is now come down here and, maybe I will add just a little bit more of a vignette to the image. So I'll come over to Effects. I'm really wanting to center my attention here on Dan. Perfect. So I'm bringing in that midpoint. I'm, again, you don't want to overuse the vignette function. You don't want it to be super obvious that you're doing it. So here we go. And then if I hit before and after, you can just see how much more he pops forward. He's not yellowish from the lights that are overhead. It is just a night and day portrait. And I'm doing all of this in Lightroom. I'm not even editing in Photoshop at all. Okay, so one thing I want to mention before we move on to some retouching in Lightroom is the idea of cropping. If you're editing a portrait, you never want to crop something on the joints because it makes someone look like they are being cut off in a very weird way. So, for example, I would never ever want to crop right here at the knees because it's going to look like his knees have been amputated in a weird way. And honestly, this just makes the whole composition look very, very much off. If I show you in the next example, you'll see this at play as well. But you want to be really, really aware of where you're cropping. In fact, this might be a little bit close to his ankles down here, so I might even pull it up above a tiny bit more, push it over, and that even feels a little bit better. Then let's hop over to our bass player. We'll walk through some of the same processes, but the nice thing is we're in generally the same environment, so I can activate this as my master by hitting that little bubble in the top right of the image. And then if I hold down my command key to select the bassist, I can hit sync and, really sync together all my white balance, clarity, sharpening, color, lens corrections. I didn't do anything to shadows. Hit synchronize. And of course I can do that to all of my other pictures of Dan, especially if I was going to send him all of these as proofs before going into any extensive retouching. But this gives me a really nice starting point for my bass player. And if I come up here and hit my before and after, yeah, you can already see a world of difference just in how that looks. So I'm going to go back to my full screen. And I notice I have a pretty harsh vertical here behind him. If I want that vertical to be 100% straight, if I go into my crop function, because I know I'm going to be cropping this image anyway, and come into my transform window, I can grab just a tiny corner of this image and rotate it just ever so slightly so that vertical is nice and straight behind his head and doesn't look like, the building is lopsided, even though that's just how I took the photo. And then I'll probably hit R again to crop, hold down my shift key, crop out some of that window. I don't need as much of the piano because he's a bass guitar player. So I'm just going to crop it in on him and put him right in the center of my grid as I'm being very mindful of my rule of thirds and composition strategies. Okay, so now we are very close. Let's find that super burn baby burn preset that we made. Hit M for mask, which brings us back to our graduated filter. And then I can add that mask over my window, brings back a whole bunch more detail, maybe even too much detail. Cool. And then M, and then M again. And let's add that to the floor here, burn in some of those highlights. And then we'll add just a tiny bit of a vignette for him as well. And you can kind of see how I've posed both of these gentlemen. You know, it's more of a casual shoot. They're jazz musicians. We unbuttoned the top blazer. You know, it's not a super like uptight shoot. It's just right after a performance. And you can kind of see in the body language, especially if I click through our bassist's pictures, you know, he was pretty uptight at the beginning. You can even just tell with the expression on his face. And then as we go forward, he just like totally loses it laughing. So any of these, you know, are great lifestyle images. I think I delivered many of these to him after we did the shoot, and he was super happy with them. So cool. So let's add that vignette to this portrait, and then we will, oh, that's not a vignette. We're going to go into effects. Pull that midpoint in. Again, I don't want anything super severe because I'm kind of seeing it peek out in this corner here. That looks pretty good. So if we hop back and start working in on some detailed retouching here, and that's something I would definitely want to do only after going through editing all of my selected images. If I'm ready to move forward on retouching, I've already done all of my basic color correction, masking, and all of that good stuff. For my retouching, what I'm looking for is sharpening where the eyes are, a little bit of teeth whitening, and then softening of the skin. And I don't want to do any of this stuff with any kind of super intensity because, again, I don't want it to call attention to itself, and I want the portrait to look still pretty natural. So what I'm going to do is come up to the top of my window here and push K. And I'm going to go find teeth whitening. And you guys are going to love this one, especially if you like having super pearly white teeth. It's going to give me a little brush here. So I get into this window by hitting my keyboard shortcut K, and that pops up all of these different effects that I can mask in with a brush instead of my graduated filter, which we used before. Super, super handy. So if I want to make this brush smaller, because I obviously don't want to whiten his whole face, I'm going to find my bracket keys that are just underneath the delete button on my keyboard, same on the Mac as the PC, and brush that in. That's a little too intense for me, I think. I'm going to hit Command Z. And I can change the density of that brush, how intense it actually applies, just by pulling this slider down a little bit. And now I can get a nice soft whitening without it like making his whole mouth look super weird. The other thing I can do is sharpen up my eyes a little bit. I like to go into K, and then what I'm going to do is actually create a new one by starting with contrast. So I'm going to start with the contrast effect, and I'm going to add, 25 or even 15 might be safer contrast, and I'm going to add 65 sharpness, and I'm going to add maybe 0.2 exposure. See how I'm sort of building out this custom eye sharpening tool, which is super, super helpful. And then I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger. I'm still at a density of 67, so it's not going to be super extreme, but I can ever so slightly brush in over his eyes, and his eyes will be a little bit brighter, a little bit more sharp, a little bit more contrasty to really pop forward through the diminished clarity that I've added. If I hit K again, I pop out of that brush and I can see how everything looks in context. Again, this is, just those final touches. I might have gone overboard on the teeth whitening, but I was working a bit quickly. Cool. So this all looks good. You know, if you have anything to clean up or like a blemish to change or whatever, I never will touch anything that's like a birthmark or a mole or something that's natural. For me, it's unethical to remove that in the editing process. But if you do see a blemish, you can hit the Q button, Q, or you can come up here to your clone stamp or healing brush. I like the healing brush tool for this a lot because it's really natural looking. Again, I'm adjusting that brush size with my brackets. And then if I see a blemish, I can hit that and it will sample from another area of the skin to smooth that out. Or I can sample or if I want to remove this little dot, again, it will sample from another part. If I hit Q again, it pops me out of that. You know, I might want to remove this tiny little spot on his tie. Works pretty well. And if I need to move where I'm sampling from, I can do it just like that. I don't really see anything else that's getting in the way, but we can take a look at our other portrait here and see if there's anything, you know, that we would want to remove as far as the spot healing. Should have had him take his wallet out of his front pocket. Hit Q, and you can get rid of some of those spots. Obviously, I wouldn't do anything to his bass guitar. It looks beat up. It is an upright bass. This thing is worth a lot of money. It should look exactly how it is, unless, you know, a client requests like, hey, can you clean up some of these spots or scratches or whatever. But I would leave this as authentic as it should be. So cool. What's crazy is the brush tool is, or the healing brush tool is pretty intense. If I hit Q again, see this little thing in the background, any wall spots, I can use it like this, and it magically, that spot on the wall disappears. This disappears. You know, I like seeing how far I can push the limits. Like if I do want to eliminate this painting in the background, you know, the bigger the surface area, the more questionable. But you'd be surprised how capable these tools are. Like, that's pretty good. I think if I softened my brush a little bit and made it a bit whiter, I'd actually be able to remove this whole thing and replace it with this part of the wall. So if I hit Command Z, we can try that again. I'm just going to make the center here of where I'm sampling a little bit bigger. And that was just by using my bracket keys. Yeah, I should have gone out just a little bit whiter, but you know, you get the point. You know, I could always come back and clean up just this frame potentially. But nope, too big. So that's not going to work. But maybe if I pulled it over here, yep. So you can do quite a bit of reconstructive surgery using the tools in Lightroom, as far as hitting that K button to do some specific masking and hitting the Q button to do some healing and cloning. But again, you never want it to look like you actually did that. You don't want to leave any evidence behind. So even looking at this, I'd probably go back and make some fine-tune edits to make sure that this whole area is completely cleaned up. Okay, let's look at a couple of different portraits, and then I will leave it to you to start editing your own portraits. And the idea is I want to show you portraits in a lot of different lighting situations and scenarios, and that's why we're kind of hopping around. So I'm going to hit import, and I'm going to pull in a set of photos that I have organized already in my hard drive here under, let's see, photo 2019. This is a maternity shoot that I did, and there'll be a couple of good examples here. Lots of cute little dog photos as well. Dogs are, whew, make sure you're photographing with a fast shutter speed with the doggies, because they will be the first that go out of focus. So I'll hit import on that set of images and pull them into Lightroom. Now you're noticing I'm not exporting my photos as JPEGs or exporting my whole catalogs like we talked about, because I'm just showing you this for the purposes of editing editing portraits. We're not going to go into the details of all of the other steps we've already talked about. So while this is importing, maybe I'll come over here to my 2020 spot. And grab that set of portraits of me. So that you can see something that's a little bit closer up and, you know, sort of studio quality. Okay, let's look at one of these window light portraits here. Great. Going to develop, and this one has not been edited or touched at all whatsoever, but we know it's nice and sharp, looking really, wow, looking good. So I will adjust my whites, my blacks, find a neutral gray like this wall, that works great. Add some contrast, again, probably add 15 points here because it's really soft light. I want to get really nice punchiness to it. I'm going to remove a bit of the clarity. Skin becomes automatically a bit more soft. And then I'm going to add just a pop of brightness here in my tone curve. Again, you're probably seeing how redundant this is, and the idea is the more you do it, the more accustomed you'll become with some of these basic tools and settings. Might take out, again, a little bit of the orange. My eyes are just super sensitive to that particular color. Cool. And there you go. I can add a bit of sharpening. And then my lens corrections. Add a bit of a vignette here. I don't want it to look quite like I have a halo, but that's a really nice start. I was lucky enough to have pretty good skin that day, but if you are working with a really close-up studio portrait and you want to eliminate any kinds of imperfections or anything, any lines or anything in the way, what you can do is hit the K button, and there is an effect for softened skin, which is a sort of like clarity on you know, something good here. We have negative 100 clarity being applied. Again, I'll probably take my density down, but I can utilize this brush with K to very, very slightly add a bit less clarity, take away some clarity, and in turn make my skin even more luminant. Again, it's a very, hit K again to get out of it. It's a very like nuanced thing, but you can see I've really nicely brightened the portrait from where we started, which was already great, photographed in great light, to where we are now, where it's been color balanced, and I've added a few of those other effects. It's looking really, really great. Adding sharpness to the eyes. I don't know, I hit K. I don't think I added that one as a preset, but if I wanted to be more intentional about that, I can do my contrast at 15, my exposure at 0.2 or even 0.1. We'll keep it really light and have sharpness up at 75 for a bit of an eye sharpening and brightening effect. Again, it's like super nuanced, but what I'm wanting to do is find ways to make those eyes just nicely pop forward. Okay. So I have sharpened up the eyes a little bit with the Eyes Quick tool. And if I want to go ahead and save that as a preset here, what I can do is save current settings as new preset. And I can actually call that Eyes Quick, and it will totally save it as a new preset for me. Now it says my preset is already in use because QuickTime stopped recording for a moment, but I just want to make sure that you guys can see how to create that. So I'm going to hit cancel, and I know that I can always now come back to Eyes Quick when I open up that menu of different edits that I can do with my brush tool here, which is great. So let's go back and check on our import here of the other folder of images from the maternity shoot and move forward from there. So I have this whole set of images from last October in Chicago. Lots of very cute dog pictures here as well for a couple who found out during the shoot that they were expecting a boy. And then I'm going to actually scroll down to a portrait of her just on her own so I can walk through some of the steps in portrait editing for something that's more of a on location. And of course, you might not have time to bring a whole gray card out with you, and or if you might forget, there are other ways to kind of balance and find the correct temperature for this. You're noticing too, I hope that as I show you this, I have photographed a lot. I overshoot constantly because you never know if you're going to get your photograph 100% sharp or in focus. So you can see in the shoot, there are quite a few pictures. And from there, I'm culling through them and using the star rating system to select the very best ones. But I'm just going to focus on one of them for now, which is this image. And I'll go into the develop module and show you one more time the magic of advanced portrait editing. First thing I'm going to do is hit R and just crop out that left-hand corner because it's really bothering me. And I'm going to line up her face on the third here and make sure that she is centered in my frame. Something to think about if you are photographing for someone else and they might be wanting to get prints made. You always want to leave a little bit of extra space so that they can, you know, crop in as they'd like. Cool. And then I'll hit enter. And now we're going to do everything that we would normally do to our portrait. I'm going to grab my color picker tool. We'll maybe pick out this neutral gray that's on the ground over here. Kind of cooled it down a little bit more than I want, but it did take it to 5600, which is right at the temperature of light. I might warm it up just a tiny bit to 5700. And that might have been where I started, but I want to see just a tiny bit more warmth here. So perfect. We'll go over to our whites and our blacks to set our black and our white point here. Holding down the Option key. Great. I'm going to add somewhere between 10 and 15, 20 points of contrast. And I'm going to pull down our shadow or our highlights just a little bit. Take out a little bit of the clarity so that we sort of get that nice softening look. Again, this is great for portraits, not great for every type of image that you might be editing. And then I'm going to add on our tone curve some lights. I'm going to add some darks, pull down some shadows. And again, I'm going to pull in a bit more information there in my highlights. So I'm going to pull the highlights down a tiny bit more. I will pull our sharpening to give that 50, and then add my lens corrections to be on the safe side. And then what we can do is hop on down to the vignette. Tiny, tiny, tiny bit just to have my subject 100% pop forward. Perfect. And now if I do my before after, it's definitely a lot brighter, stronger image here on the right. Cool. Last but not least, what I want to do is just zoom in on the face. If there's anything that really needs to be cleaned up, I think, you know, especially with outdoor lifestyle photos like this, I could go through and detail, you know, the face, add the clarity, you know, I don't have to go 100% editorial on it, but I could add those other effects if I wanted to. But I think what I would do in the case of this shoot is once I have everything starred out with my star rating system, I just pulled in the raws so I don't have my actual full catalog here because I wanted to make sure I could show you the whole difference between this. But what's great about being able to synchronize these edits is that if I hit that bubble up in the top right hand corner, hold down my shift button, all of these photos are exactly the same. So if I hit sync, I have all of those settings that I can synchronize. And the last thing we got that. The last thing that I will want to do, yep, and they have all had those edits applied. The last thing I'll want to do is just make sure that I've cropped them all exactly how I'd like. Now again, I might not return all of these to the person who I was photographing, but now at least I have, I know that I have the ability to add my, you know, this one, it's particularly obvious. You can kind of see how all of those effects diminished the amount of darkness under her eyes. Definitely helped. And then once I have all of my images edited with my stars, I can hit Command A to select all of them. I'll export them. I'll export my catalog, and I'll be good. I hope that that helps, giving 3 different scenarios for portrait editing, learning a little bit about the graduated filter tool and our brush tool K to do a bunch of different really useful things. And just like with anything in Lightroom, if anything that you're doing is drawing attention to itself, it's probably not the thing that you should be doing. So just be mindful of how severe you push something. But we're looking for great exposures when you're photographing. That's step 1. And then everything else falls into place as you move forward, adjusting your histogram. And then, of course, all of those other settings in your develop module. Great. Can't wait to see all of your portrait work.